Tokatoa. Kia orana, Nisa Bula, and Talofa Lava. Welcome to the CID talk on the Pacific Human Rights Data. My name is Philippa Smales, the Business and Development Manager here at the Council for International Development. I'm really honoured today to introduce the Human Rights Measurement Initiative team, or HRMI as their initials, and they say it's HRMI. So welcome the HRMI team. They recently released their 2021 Rights Tracker scores, measuring countries' human rights performance. So team members Anne-Marie, Roi and Thalia will discuss the scores for Pacific countries and upcoming further research on issues important to all the Pacific communities. So it'll be really interesting to hear about this. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Philippa, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here today. So my name's Anne-Marie Brook. I'm one of the co-founders of HRMI, and I'll just start by giving you saying a little bit about HRMI, and then I'll just pass over to Thalia and Roi to really quickly introduce themselves before we really kick off. So the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we say HRMI for short, as Philippa mentioned. We're a global collaborative human rights database producing data to track the human rights performance of countries. We have a base in New Zealand, which is we're hosted. Our New Zealand operations are hosted by Motu Economic and Public Policy Research, which is a not-for-profit research institute based in Wellington, and I'm part of the Wellington-based HRMI team. And so, just to continue the introductions, I'll pass over to you, Thalia.
Maori, talofa lava, whakalofa atu, talohani. Tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings from Wellington, where it's sunny today, though much colder than where many of you are. I'm Thalia Kehoe Rowden, and I'm part of the HRMI team with a base in Wellington, and I have responsibility for getting our data out into the world, into the hands of people who can use it to improve people's lives. So I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, CID, for the invitation to be here. And I'll pass over to Roi.
Cool, thank you, Thalia. Kamna Benini Māori. My name is Roi, and I am part of the HRMI Pacific team. I can see some friends from the New Zealand High Commission in Tarawā, so hi. Great to see you all again. So like I said, I'm a research assistant on HRMI Pacific team, and I'm also currently doing my master's at the moment in Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Roi. Now, I'm just hoping it's not going to be too much of a problem. My dog just started barking in the background, so hopefully he's going to calm down soon. So Thalia, if I can ask you to just start sharing our slides, and I'll say a little bit more. On the first slide, we just have the names of the three of us who we've just introduced ourselves. And I also already mentioned that you know, our New Zealand operations are hosted by Motu Research. We also have a team of people who are based in the United States, particularly our civil and political rights team, which is based at the University of Georgia. And then we have a network of people working with us around the world, our ambassadors in each of the countries where we collect data, you know, on the ground. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So on this slide, just a few points introducing you to the work that we do. My elevator pitch description of, at the moment, it changes all the time, of how I describe what we do is that HRMI is a global human rights data platform aiming to disrupt the status quo. And by status quo, I mean the fact that many countries, all countries around the world, have to make decisions all the time about how to use their resources and how to treat people. And, you know, many of those decisions being made are not the ones that we would want to see. So decisions are often not being made that prioritize the people in each country. Human rights, really, that's what human rights are about. It's about creating the environment that allows each one of us to thrive. And you know, the global community has defined and set out human rights in a whole series of international human rights treaties and covenants. We take those definitions as given, and we figure out the best ways to produce robust, comprehensive data that can track how well countries are doing on each of those rights. We have got two main methodologies. Both of them are groundbreaking, and right at the very beginning when we started working together, we set the goal that we wanted to make sure that our methodologies would be, and our data would be, equally well accepted by both human rights practitioners and academics. And both of those groups are really important for slightly different reasons. Academics are important because they often have the really sophisticated understanding of the techniques and statistical methods that we use. And we want to make sure that the methods we're using pass the kind of peer review test of being accepted as state-of-the-art, really best practice. And human rights practitioners are really important because they're the people who know what's going on in their country in terms of human rights. And we want to make sure that they see our data and recognize and can see how it accurately captures the nuances of, how is this country performing? Where is it performing really well? Where is it performing not so bad and not so well, and so forth. I'm just going to have to take one really quick break here just to let my dog out of the room. So just hold on one sec. Great, I'm back. Our goal in doing this work is to be useful. We are not an advocacy organisation ourselves, so we don't take country scores to governments and talk to them about what they could change in order to improve the situation on the ground. We're producing these data to be used by people like those of you who are joining this presentation today. And so I hope that you'll all get some ideas, maybe as Thalia is particularly demonstrating our rights tracker, thinking it'd be great to have you all thinking about how you might be able to bring some of this data into the work that you do, so that together collaboratively we can help to transform the world that we live in and improve the lives of people. Moving on to the next slide, this really provides a summary of a very high-level summary of the data that we produce. So we're publishing data on 13 rights. 5 of them are economic and social rights, and 8 of them are civil and political rights. And one of the first things you'll probably notice on this slide is that we've got really different country coverage for the 2 different types of rights. And so I'll explain why that is right now. The reason is we measure these 2 different types of rights using really different methodologies. For economic and social rights, so these are the rights to food, education, health, housing, and work, we use publicly available statistics that are produced within countries, and then they're uploaded to internationally harmonized databases. So the data that we're producing our country scores from come from places like the World Bank, UNESCO, the OECD, the World Health Organization, and so forth. But what we do is we don't just take the data as you might have, as you could download them from one of those databases. What we do is then overlay a human rights lens. So that allows us to see not just, for example, what life expectancy is in a country, which might give you some indication of how well the health system is performing, but how well that country is doing relative to how it could do given its level of income. So we know that richer countries can be expected to have a better health system than poorer countries, but different countries, even at the same income level, get really different outcomes in each of these different areas: health, education, nutrition, and so forth. And so what we're really doing is benchmarking how well each country does relative to the best performing countries at that country's income level. For civil and political rights, we use a completely different approach, and that's because there are no publicly available statistics already that we can draw on to measure civil and political rights. So these are things like the right to not be tortured, right to freedom of opinion and expression, voting rights, things like that. So we have co-designed a brand new methodology. It's now been running for about 4 years, where we ask human rights experts in countries to share with us their knowledge about how well their country is respecting each of the rights that we're measuring. We started off running the survey in 13 countries. We're now up to 39. Our goal is to reach the whole world as soon as possible. And I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge MFAT, who have been funding the expansion of this, the rollout of the expert survey approach across the Pacific region. So the Pacific region is the first region of the world where we have complete or very close to complete data coverage of all civil and political rights. And I will soon be passing over to Thalia, but first I'll just mention that all the scores that we produce are available on our website, rightstracker.org. And Thalia will, in a moment, in a few minutes, be doing a demonstration of the Rights Tracker so that you can see, how to use it, what data might be useful to you, and so forth. But before going to Thalia, we're first going to go to Roi. So I'm going to pass over the speaking to Roi. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Cool. So as well as our economic and social rights and civil and political rights that we measure, we also have what is called our Pacific module. So the Pacific module is a series of questions in our HRMI expert survey that is only asked to survey respondents from the Pacific region. And how this came about was through a co-design workshop that HRMI hosted in August of 2019. And like Anne-Marie said, our Pacific expansion was funded from a grant from New Zealand's aid program. So during this time, HRMI was looking to expand the work that it was already doing in the Pacific region. And part of doing that was to bring about 40 or so representatives from around the region together in Auckland to talanoa, as we say, or to have discussions around human rights issues in the region and to help improve how HRMI might measure that. So it was during this workshop that our Pacific representatives gave some really valuable insights into human rights issues that are specific to the Pacific region, and issues that our workshop participants felt weren't necessarily being covered within or captured within the HRMI expert survey. So following that workshop, HRMI listened, and a separate module or a separate set of questions was included in HRMI's expert survey to better reflect some of these issues that were identified. So the Pacific module was piloted last year, and the Pacific team, we're currently in the process of going through that data from the 2021 survey. And if we, so the next slide. So the human rights issues that were talked about during that workshop, there were many issues that were sort of discussed, but the group settled on 5 key themes. So the 5 key themes that make up our Pacific module are the effect of the climate crisis on human rights. So we know that the climate crisis is the most pressing issue facing the region. There is a theme on Indigenous sovereignty. So these questions ask our survey respondents, to what extent are Indigenous communities able to govern themselves? We have a theme on Indigenous land rights, a theme on cultural rights. So this theme asks questions about the extent to which Indigenous communities can practice their cultural rights or speak their languages. And then lastly, we have a set of questions around violence. So particularly violence against vulnerable groups, specifically the violence against the rainbow community, violence against women and girls, violence against children, and violence against people with disabilities. So that makes up the questions asked in our Pacific module. And leading the work in this space is our Pacific data team. So the 3 of us are based up here in Auckland at the University of Auckland. And leading that work is our 2 Pacific data leads. So we have Dr. Sam Manuela, who is a Cook Islands researcher and lecturer based in the School of Psychology. And we have Siuta Awhili, Dr. Patrick Thompson, who is a Samoan researcher and lecturer based now in global studies. And then assisting both of those 2 is myself as a research assistant. So at the moment, like I said, we're currently going through the data from the 2021 survey. And for the first time, we will be launching that at an event in early September. as well as for the first time, which we're really excited about, is that this data will be published and made publicly available on our Rights Tracker website. So we're really excited about that. I can't really talk too much about the findings from the Pacific module, but if anyone did have any questions about the work that we're doing in the Pacific module, then please feel free to pop that in the chat as well. So cool, thank you. And I will now pass over to Thalia.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to give you a tour through the Rights Tracker, and while I share my screen and go there, I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask you all, if you're comfortable to do this, to introduce yourselves in the chat box. So if everybody could just tell us who you are and what parts of the Pacific you work in or oversee or are from, it would be lovely to be able to see that. And I will also share my screen and take you through the Rights Tracker. So you should now be able to see my screen showing the Rights Tracker. The address that anyone can go to is rightstracker.org. It's also available in a few other languages. Particularly relevant for the Pacific is that it's available in French and also in Chinese. So if you're sharing any of the data with people around the world, you can make sure that they know that they can change the language. You can navigate the Rights Tracker, which has all of our data. Everything we produce is publicly available and freely available so that anybody can use it under a Creative Commons license. You can navigate it in three ways. You can go by right if you're particularly interested in the right to education throughout the world or in a region, or if you're particularly interested in voting rights, then you can go to the rights menu and choose the right that you're interested in, and you will then see the scores for every country on the right that you're looking at. Or you can just go by country, which is what we're going to start with in a moment. Or for the 39 countries that we run our survey in, which includes the entire Pacific, you can search the Rights Tracker going by people groups. So you might look at Indigenous people, or you might look at children or people with disabilities, and you can navigate through using this people menu. But what most people do is just put in a country into the search box. So I'm going to show you a few different screens with different data from different Pacific places. And if anyone has any particular requests, then do also just let me know. But I thought I would start today with Tonga. So we'll go here, and for every country, there is a country page which has a bunch of tabs and collects all the information we have. The first thing that you see on this At a Glance tab is all of the scores that we have for Tonga, all in one go. And one useful thing about this At a Glance view is that you can click here and download a PDF, which will arrange all of our data for Tonga in a nice, pretty printable document that you could attach, for instance, as an appendix to a report that you were doing. So do feel free to play around with that. I'm going to start by looking at the first of our sets of data for quality of life, for economic and social rights. And so I'm just going to go for a little bit more depth to the quality of life tab. And we'll see Tonga's scores for the right to education, food, health, housing, and work. Now, these scores come about, as Anne-Marie said, by taking data from international databases, the kind of data that you could all access yourselves on primary school enrolment rates or babies born at a low birth weight or not, those kinds of things. We take that information and because the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights takes income into account, then we do that too. So the international obligation for a country is to do its best with what it has to progressively realise these rights by devoting the maximum available resources to make sure that as many people as possible will enjoy these rights. So what we're measuring here is to what extent a country is doing all that we calculate it could do with its current level of income. A score of 100%, or you see this one for the score for the right to work, is 99.2%. That's brilliant. That's a good score. And that tells us that for this right, Tonga is doing as well as we calculate it could do, given the constraints of its income. So we are judging every country according to its own income. So there's a level playing field for the scores. So this is a good score. And it may look to you, those of you who have been to school and to university, it may look to you at first glance that all of these scores are pretty good. And if you got them on your report card, you'd be pretty happy. But we've got these little bands here to show you that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because these are not like exam results where a score, for instance, for the right to health of 74.4% is still pretty good. Actually, this falls into the band that we've labeled very bad. And that's because these are not exam results. These are more like how close to complete is the task. The task that Tonga needs to complete is to do its best for its people with what it has, and that would be 100%. And it's a bit like if I ask my son to do the dishes, and he comes back and tells me that he has done 74.4% of the dishes, I will not be very happy. That's a lot of dishes that I am going to have to clean up after him. And so we need to focus not just on the achievement here, but on the gap between 74.4% and the expectation of 100%. Because we are, on our calculations, Tonga could reach 100%. And that's what we all hope for all people around the world, that their countries will be doing all they really can. So for each of these scores, we have a little bit more data if you scroll down. And I encourage you, if you are a numbers person and you like looking at all the information available, just about everything on the rights tracker is clickable. So you can hover on things and you can click on things and see extra information, and you can scroll down. So we have a bit of a narrative here, just putting the data in context. And these are sentences that you can lift out and just copy and use in reports if you want to. So you can be sure that this is exactly the right way of accurately explaining what the data show. And if we go here, we see where some of the sort of sub-rights that we are also measuring that go towards the rights. So the right to education for Tonga is measured by looking at the right to primary education and the right to secondary education. And these are the scores that HRMI has produced for Tonga for these two sub-rights. Now, these are not the raw values of what's going on if you are a child in Tonga, but we do have those available. So if you go to indicator values, you'll see that we're getting these data from enrolment rates. And you'll see here that the primary school enrolment rate in Tonga is 98.9%. And I mean, that's just about every kid in school. That's brilliant. And our score, if you flick back, is 98.1%, because we calculate that at its level of income, perhaps more children could be in school, but not very many more. So it's a pretty good score. It falls into the good band. But for secondary education, we go to the indicator value. We see that 82.1% of teenagers in Tonga are currently in school. And our score, where we're scoring the government's performance, is 90%, which falls into the fair band. So the indicator value is the underlying data, and the HRMI score is when we take the income of the country into account and we make a judgment about how well the government is doing at keeping its human rights promises. For some of the rights, you can disaggregate by sex. And so we have those available here for education, food, and health. These are not comparisons of female to male. They're comparisons of government performance for females compared to the rest of the world, and government performances for males compared to the rest of the world. So they're about the government obligation to look after the rights of these groups of people. And you can see the scores for Tonga for all of these rights plotted over time. So for instance, we were looking at education before. You can see that there was a drop about a decade ago and a lift, and things have been pretty good for a while. You could go to the right to food and see it's been steady. That hasn't changed, which may well be because there hasn't been an updated survey that's giving the underlying data. Right to health, you see it moving just slightly each year, and it's fallen a little bit lately. Now, I should point out, as you may have noticed, that our most recent score is for 2018. Now, we produced the score for 2018 only a couple of months ago in 2021. There is a necessary time lag between people in Tonga supplying data on, for instance, enrolment rates to the international organisation that collects those data for all countries. It takes a while for that organisation to collect the data from 200 countries, to harmonise it, to check it, to publish it. By the time it gets published, it then just takes another few months for us to go through our analysis for the whole world and publish the data. So these are the most recently available data in the world. No one has anything more recent. And we acknowledge that it would be nice if we had much more recent data and we could be producing scores for just last year. But this is the best that anyone can do because of just how long it takes to produce data for a lot of countries around the world. The good thing about that lag, well, the silver lining is that you will have seen that there's not a lot of movement in these scores. We don't tend to see volatility, and so it's still pretty useful to know where things were, at the most recent data point. Excuse me. Of course, the limitation for these rights is that when there is international disruption or national disruption, that we're not capturing that in these data. And so obviously the pandemic has changed everything for everybody. And we have an extra set of research on the effect of the pandemic on human rights, which we'll talk about later on. But what we do have, because we have this gap, we don't have scores for 2019 and 2020. What we do have for countries in the Pacific, because they're part of our expert survey process, is that we ask our experts about who's missing out on their economic and social rights, and we give you that information on the same page if you scroll down a bit further. And it's also collected on this People at Risk tab here. So I might actually just take you to the People at Risk tab. And we have word clouds for each of the rights, one after another. And so what we have here is that in Tonga, our expert respondents identified these groups as being at risk of not enjoying their right to food. So 38% of our experts identified LGBTQIA+ people as being at risk of having the right to food violated, and 38% of our expert respondents identified single parent families as being at risk for the right to food as well. There'll be a bunch of different groups listed, and some there'll be less agreement. Not so many people ticked the group, but if a group appears here, we feel confident saying that that group is at risk of experiencing violations. And this is for the year 2020. So this set of data, the word clouds, is very recent and up to date because it comes from our survey. There's also a little bit more information. If you click show more, you'll see a little bit more information that experts gave in their own words in an extra box. And so sometimes it'll be very specific information, like here for the right to housing, it says Chinese people, particularly those living in Pātangata. You can also, in this view, you can choose a group of people that you're interested in, so perhaps single parent families, and you can highlight it so that it will appear pre-highlighted in all of the word clouds. So if there's a group that you are interested in tracking their experience over a range of human rights, you can scroll down and see where they appear. And that can reveal some useful things to know as you go down. So we've been focusing on Tonga for the quality of life rights. I thought we might choose a different country to look at our civil and political rights. So let's perhaps go to Papua New Guinea, where I grew up as a baby. I was there for a couple of years when I was very little, close to my heart. So here on the at a glance page, we see all of the scores together. So you can see the economic and social rights, and you'll be able to tell that that's telling a pretty concerning story about life in Papua New Guinea there. And then we also have these rights for safety from the state and empowerment. These are civil and political rights, and these are our much more up-to-date rights scores that are measuring how things were in 2020. And you can see more depth of detail by going to the appropriate tab. So if we go to safety from the state, we see that the scores for these rights are listed here, and then those scores are displayed within a band here. So for the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, the score is 3.7 out of 10, and that falls into the band that we've labeled bad, just for a bit of guidance about how to interpret the scores. Now, this does fall within a band between 2.3 and 5. And this is the uncertainty band. It's a little bit like a margin of error in a political poll, just to show how sure we are that 3.7 is the right score, or perhaps what the range of other possible correct scores might be. Now, you'll see that this one for arbitrary arrest and detention is quite broad, and then this one for the right to freedom from torture is much more narrow. The length of the band is influenced by a couple of factors. One is the number of respondents to our survey. Now, within Papua New Guinea, we probably had around about the same number of respondents for each of the rights questions. It may be that one or two people didn't complete the whole survey, so we might have, some variation in that. But probably the difference between this very broad band and this narrow one is the second factor, which is the level of difference between people's answers. And so when we asked people what the experience was in Papua New Guinea in 2020 in terms of how people were treated in terms of the right to freedom from torture and ill treatment, people had the same answers. Everyone agreed that it was about here. But when it came to the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, people gave slightly more divergent answers. They're still clearly all in this range from very bad to bad, so that tells us something meaningful, which is very different from what people said about the right to freedom from extrajudicial execution, for instance. But there was a broader range of experience represented in our sample of people who answered. And perhaps some people were answering from different geographical areas. And so they're telling us quite truly and accurately that things were very bad, or that things were on their way to fair, because the first-hand experiences that they are describing just were different. We've gathered together trend charts for all of those rights in one place. So this is the same as the overtime trend chart that we saw for economic and social rights. It's just presented a little differently, so you can see them all at once. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation. The right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, things have worsened. There's a reasonably sharp drop from last year from 2019 to 2020. Things are reasonably steady on the right to freedom from disappearance, freedom from the death penalty. If the death penalty is not in use in the country gets an automatic 10 out of 10. Freedom from extrajudicial execution, things have got significantly better. That's good news. And it's worth pointing out that one of the features of the rights tracker for a user is that it tells both good news and bad news stories. So it's not that we're putting out a report of all of the worst things that are happening. We're just showing the facts, and there will be good news stories to find, as well as stories of things deteriorating. And so looking through all of these data can help you to be encouraged, and can help you to see where to focus energy. And then below that, we have these people at risk word clouds, which again, you can see all gathered together on the people at risk tab. And again, you can highlight a group and see where they show up all the way through. Now, if I want to show you empowerment as well, which works on the same methodology, but I'll just take you to another country. So let's go to Fiji. So if we go straight to the empowerment tab, we see that for the rights to assembly and association, and opinion and expression, and the right to participate in government, these are all reasonably low scores. Fiji has had these reasonably low scores for a long time. That won't be a surprise to many people, I imagine. And our narrative compares Fiji with other countries in the Pacific. And on this category, we can say that Fiji is performing worse than average on empowerment rights. And you can see with these time trends for 4 years of data that there haven't been any significant improvements there. And again, we have the people at risk here, and it's quite a long list. So there's a lot of data here that you can use to paint a picture of how the government is treating people. For regional comparisons, you use the rights menu. So we'll just take back to the front to clear our minds. So on the rights menu, you could, for instance, go to right to education, and you're going to get scores for, a lot of the world. And because we're focusing on the Pacific today, you can just filter and show only the Pacific countries. And so here you have the Pacific countries lined up in order of their score, but you can also sort them by, for instance, population. So Australia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand will go to the top. And so that will give you an idea of whether there are trends that are affected by population. You could sort it by GDP per capita to see if income is affecting things. But remember that these scores do themselves take income into account. And you can also, you might want to go to one of the civil and political rights. So if we go to the right to assembly and association, now we've got 35 countries here. I'll go back to sorting it by score. And let's filter just to see the Pacific, which make up about half of our sample. So here you can see all of the countries that we have these scores for lined up together. And I think the first thing to note is that Pacific countries generally, if we can make claims about regional trends, the Pacific region is the best performing region that we observe on all of the civil and political rights. And so the top, in fact, if I take the filter off, you'll see that the top doesn't change, because the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the first 8 countries of our 35 with the top scores are all Pacific countries. So I'll put that filter back on just so we can see them all together. Because these bands are reasonably wide for many Pacific countries, and it's just because of the size of the country and the size of the sample of people we're able to reach. If 2 countries have overlapping bands, so for instance, New Caledonia here and Kiribati here, the score, the raw score, the score of 8.3 versus 8.1 would suggest that New Caledonia, is doing a slightly better job than Kiribati of respecting this right, but the bands overlap entirely. And so it's entirely possible that Kiribati is actually doing, has a score of 9 and New Caledonia has a score of 7.9. So we would not say that we know which is performing better out of these 2 countries. But if we compare Kiribati with Nauru, there's no overlap at all, and so we can definitely say that Kiribati is doing better than Nauru on this measurement, on this score, on this right. So I think I'm going to stop sharing for the moment, and I'll hand back to Anne-Marie. We could talk about our COVID report, and we could talk about gender, and we could talk about SDGs. So I'll be interested to know if people want to spend some time on those things. And we know that we've just covered an enormous amount of information, and you will have questions. So I'll hand back to Anne-Marie to moderate. I'm going to have a look at the chat box and see what interests you all have and where we might take things. And I'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, Thalia. I always enjoy watching your Rights Tracker demos because I always learn something new. So I would just like to invite any either verbal questions or pop your questions into the chat box. As Thalia mentioned, there's plenty of other things that we could talk about, but it'd be great to hear what you would most like to hear about. And the other thing I will just mention while you're thinking about what your questions might be or writing them into the chat box is that we're really available to provide assistance. So if this session has given you some idea, but you're not quite some idea about how you might be able to use HRMI data in one of your reports or a UPR submission or some of your research or I don't know anything, an advocacy campaign, but you're not quite sure how you might implement it, please get in touch with us because we'd really love to work with you on that and provide whatever advice we can. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, so I'll just stop talking to give people the space to speak up. Okay, I see one question for Thalia. Thalia, you mentioned that the score showed what a country was doing compared to what it has the means to do. Does your research show the reasons why a particular country may not be doing as well as it could with what it has? I'll let you answer that, Thalia.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we are we're doing it on a pure economic analysis, and so we are asking of all the countries. So if we say take Tonga again, as we looked at their scores, of all the countries in the world with the same level of GDP per capita as Tonga, how many kids are in school? So we look at that sort of indicator data. And if we find that there are countries doing better than Tonga on the same level of income, then we're saying that there is a benchmark that another country has set of how well you can do on this kind of income. And so that's where we get our score. So our scores do not reflect the local challenges. And certainly in some countries, there will be very specific things that you would want to point out if you are speaking about that country. We are not experts, obviously, on the individual circumstances of 200 countries. And so what we see our role as is providing this analysis and putting it into your hands. And to the extent that you who know a particular country find it useful, then you will be able to provide that context when you're using it. You'll be able to say, well, we get a score of this, but it's probably because of our geography, or it's, we have to take this into account. Or you can say, well, we're getting this score and look at all of the other countries doing better. So we would like our government to prioritize this and move our score upwards. So it's really up to people who have much more knowledge than us about the local circumstances to put the context around the scores. What we find generally is that, having had these conversations with hundreds of people over a few years, we find that for the vast majority of the scores, people find them accurate and reflective of their impression of how things are going in their country and how they could be going. And there are definitely exceptions to that. So there are some places where people think that there is some exceptional circumstance that means that it's not capturing something in particular. One, for instance, in the Pacific that we have ongoing questions about is that our right to food scores come from data on child stunting. And a lot of Pacific countries do well on the right to food in terms of our scores, where those countries would say that the level of, for instance, non-communicable diseases would suggest that the right to food is not being enjoyed by a lot of people. And those are, particular sort of regional challenges. So there will be specific things that you'd want to have a further conversation about. And if you see specific things, we'd really like to have those conversations and see if it's a data interpretation thing that we can work through, or whether it's a local situation that you are the experts on. I've just put some links in the chat box for your reference. You might just want to copy them or just open them up and look at them later. The kinds of things that you might find useful. There's a guide to using our data in UPR reporting, which would also be true for if you are involved in reporting to any other treaty bodies in the UN system. And there are two YouTube links. And I encourage you, if you're interested in questions of, so hold on, how do you do this and why do you do it the way you do? They're short animated videos explaining our methodologies, and they're quite enjoyable to watch, and I think explain things quite usefully. Now I think we have some more questions coming through, so I'll have a look.
So there's one question I've answered in the chat, and there's another question that I'll answer verbally. So the question is, have you experienced any backlashes from governments on your analysis? That's a really great question. The answer to date is no, but it's something that we are, very conscious that could happen. In part, part of the reason why we might not have received backlash is that we don't actively seek to engage. We don't actively seek to engage with governments ourselves. So we don't take our governments to we don't take our scores to governments and seek their feedback on them. If we did, then I think that would lead to some really constructive conversations, and I'd quite like to do more of that, but we're not really resourced to do that at present. There are, a number of countries in our expert survey sample are countries that are very hostile to human rights. So examples would be Saudi Arabia, for example, and Vietnam. Saudi Arabia has been in our survey sample right since the very early pilot stage. And in countries that are very hostile to human rights, we're very aware that the work that human rights defenders are doing in those countries can be dangerous, and but for all countries, we go to a lot of effort to protect the identity of survey respondents. So survey respondents are anonymous, and we do all we can to protect. We do a lot to protect the anonymity of the individual survey responses before they're aggregated into country scores. Next year, we will be expanding the survey coverage to more countries, and this will include China and India. So by that point, by this time next year, we'll have coverage of more than half of the world's population. China is a country that has a lot of resources that they use to, to counter human rights and produce counter narratives about the importance of human rights. So we're really conscious that at some point, we could come under attack. It wouldn't surprise us. And if and when that happens, I guess we would see that as a reflection of the positive impact that we're having, drawing attention to these issues.
Hi, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just turn your mic on and ask them as well. If you want to just ask anyone from the team anything about the tracking.
So I see, Thalia, you've put a link to the COVID-19 report into the chat box, and I'll just draw people's attention to the fact that there's some really, really interesting responses that came out of this report. And so if you go to the link that Thalia's provided, there's an appendix that has a lot of information for each country. So you could go to the country or countries of interest to you and look at specifically the country-specific ways in which the government's response to the pandemic in your country has affected human rights. I mean, one thing that we were all really struck by is that all rights have been affected by handling of the pandemic, and the economic and social rights in particular. So, just people trying to get access to food during lockdowns and things like that, just very pervasive and very significant effects.
So I'm sharing my screen again, just to talk briefly about the COVID report. I'd encourage you to follow the link that we put in the chat box. That the report's really readable. It's in plain English. It's not, it's not a technical one. It's not too dense. But it organises our survey responses into all of the different rights categories and tags each country. So you'll be able to see what people have said for the particular places that you are working or you are based. There's a lot of rich information in there about the effects on people of the government response to the pandemic, because so many governments, every government has responded in a different way, and so we really hope that some of this data will help governments to change things a little bit, to work on how they're responding to the pandemic, to minimise the negative impacts on rights of what they're doing, as well as to control the pandemic to increase people's enjoyment of their rights. We essentially asked people in the survey what has been the effect in your country in 2020. of the government response to the pandemic and which rights have been affected. And those data are available only in this report, so do have a look at it. But we also then gave space for people to just say anything they wanted, and those data about what people said about COVID-19 are on the rights tracker. So when you go to those word clouds, the people at risk tab of each country, when you click that show more and see the bullet points, many of those bullet points will refer to COVID-19.
Just maybe another thing that I'll mention while we've still got time is just coming back to the introduction that Roy provided earlier to the information in the Pacific module. That data is not currently on the rights tracker, but it will be. So, you know, when you go to a particular country page, you have the different tabs along the top. So you have the at a glance, you have quality of life, safety from the state, empowerment, people at risk. There will be a new tab next to that called Pacific module or something. I'm not sure exactly what it will be called. And on that, if you click on that tab, you will then get the responses, you know, a high level summary of the responses to the specific question types, the question areas that were asked in the Pacific module. And Roy, do you want to just say a little bit more about the timing for when we're proposing to do this? I think you mentioned early September.
Yeah, that's right. So what we're planning to do with the Pacific module data is we will hold what we call a launch event. So I think we're aiming for the 1st of September. And I think we'll be doing it up here in Auckland actually. But there will be, you'll be able to zoom in, we're hoping, so we will sort that out as well. And then following the launch, or actually before the launch, we're hoping that that data will be available on the rights tracker as well. So, yeah.
Okay, I can see another question. With the goal of disrupting the status quo, how might the benchmarks change? And then another question, does cultural relativity play a role in how data is collected and compared?
Those are good questions. I'll take that if you like.
Yeah.
Slightly different answers with the two methodologies. How might the benchmarks change when it comes to economic and social rights? The benchmarks should always be changing. There should always be better performance. So our benchmarks are based on the best observed performance in the last 20 years around the world at every income level. And so as a new country gets more kids in school or has an even lower stunting rate of babies, then the benchmark will move out and everyone will need to keep upping their performance to reach it. So that's with the economic and social rights. With civil and political rights, the benchmark is that there will be there will be no examples of breaches in a country, so that no one will be tortured, no one will be disappeared, no one will have their free expression curtailed. So that, I think we're all reaching for that. It's a long way away yet, so we're not going to need to worry about that one moving anytime soon. In terms of cultural relativity, I think that the things that I would think about there are that when it comes to our expert survey, the first thing to note is that we are asking people who are experts in the countries concerned. They might sometimes be based outside the country, but that's a very small group of people, and it tends to be for places like Saudi Arabia. Probably all of our people are not in Saudi because it's not safe to be there, but we don't know because it's all done carefully and securely and anonymously. So, you know, we don't track where people are. So we are getting people's local impressions. Now, one of the ways that we find out that we take into account, I guess, cultural relativity would be one of the factors, is that when we ask, say, you, what do you think, or how bad do you think things have been in your country last year, you might say, things have been terrible. And we don't know what that means. Like, are you just a dramatic kind of person? Do you think everything's terrible if there's one example, or were things really terrible? And so what we do is that for each of these areas of rights, we ask a kind of control question. So we describe to you 3 fictional countries, one which is pretty wonderful, one which is pretty terrible, and one which is in the middle. And we ask you to place them on the same scale. And if you tell us that all of those are really terrible, then that tells us how to interpret your answer about your country. And so that helps to moderate, particularly when people have been in a really oppressed environment that has recently opened up. They might think everything's wonderful because comparatively it is wonderful. Actually, it's still pretty terrible. But then we're going to know that because we're going to ask them about these countries, control countries. And similarly, people in a country that's doing really well might be really aware of the one example that was made public of extrajudicial execution, and they'll be shocked by it and say it's terrible, when if you compare their country to another one, clearly things are much better. And so we use this moderating technique to take account of the very different ways that people will be interpreting what's going on in their country. Does that help to answer your question, Chris?
All right, thank you so much, the HRMI team. We're unfortunately out of time. I'm sure that, there's probably a lot more questions, but yes, unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you so much. I mean, there's such a treasure trove of information on that website, and I encourage everybody to have a look and have a little bit of a play through and find all that information for the different countries they're interested in. And I'm sure that you can contact the team through the website. We'll also be sending out to everybody the recording of this, plus those links as well for everybody. But otherwise, thank you, and I'll see you at the next Sid Talk.
Thanks everybody for having us. I've just put our email addresses in the chat box as well, and we will send out an email with resources.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.